Is an exaggeration to say that we would not be here if it wasn't for Jamiel Kadri. So Jamiel, born and raised in Charleston, South Carolina. He is a leader in the great Lebanese mafia community in Charleston. He attended Clemson University, which is why this sits right next to the Rosary. And he is the founder of Fulcrum Staffing, which he started in 2008. Before that, he was a corporate finance person, worked with IBM, I think, in Charlotte, is that right?
Intern and then PwC in Charlotte.
And then he started what's called the Fun None Bowl. And the Fun None Bowl, it was a fundraiser for groups like Barbara Denton's and others that, created a Catholic community atmosphere, brought families together to bowl and to enjoy fellowship, and in the process raising money and giving money to good Catholic charities and Christian charities. So he got that going. At the same time, he started to raise a family with his beautiful wife Bridget, and bringing into the world five children, beautiful children. And he realized at some point that, with a growing family, that it is difficult to manage something like the Fun None Bowl, even with great help like that of Ann Hobday and other volunteers who did so much to keep that going. And he was looking for a way to sustain those good works. And through that, we kind of morphed into what you see now in Carolina Catholic Professionals without, forgetting the Fun None Bowl. That has been a part of what we've done too since we launched Carolina Catholic Professionals. But it's his work at the very start that got this going, that made this possible. And he lives his faith. He is a Christian Catholic gentleman, and he is a leader in our Catholic community, and it's my great honor and privilege to be able to introduce Jamiel Kadri.
I don't deserve all that credit, but I certainly appreciate the kind words, and very, very blessed with a lot of help with all those things, and we'll talk about some of that day. Ann Hobday has been a huge part of the Fun None Bowl, and making it go, and Richard White, so I'll look forward to telling that story here a little bit in a minute. But I'd like to just start with a prayer. For those of you who know it, remember, Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Come, Holy Spirit, from the hearts of the faithful, kindle in us the fire of your love. Send forth your Spirit, so we shall be created, and you shall be the face of the earth. O God, who by the light of the Holy Spirit instructs the hearts of the faithful, grant that by that same Holy Spirit we may be wise and rejoice in your consolations. Amen. Don will appreciate this story. You guys ever heard the pearly gates interview? A man dies and goes to the pearly gates. St. Peter says, before you come in, I have to ask, what was the greatest act of courage in your life? The man thinks for a minute and says, well, there was this one time I told my wife she was wrong. St. Peter raises an eyebrow and says, impressive. When was that? The man replies, about 3 minutes ago. That's usually about how that works out. I do have a talk prepared, and I have an outline, and I think given Frank's encouragement not to stand behind the podium because of my good fortune of being a short guy, and I stand over here, so you might see me walk behind there every so often, but really it's a pleasure to be here and get to speak. There's a lot of people in this room that I've known for a long time and have a tremendous amount of admiration for, and grateful for all that everybody here does for our faith here in the Low Country, around the state. It's a beautiful thing, so everybody's been a wonderful part of my journey as well. I'm going to talk about my faith journey, and I'm going to tell the story of that from the early days, and some places where, we all have these moments and we all know them, but there's just some very crystal clear places where God just put me on a path, and it was just amazing for me to follow that path to see where it took me. And you know, you knew it. You know, you knew that you were going in the right direction, or sometimes that you need to do something different. But my story starts here in Charleston. I'm a native Charlestonian. Come from a huge Lebanese family, as Frank said, the clan, the Shahid family, this kind of the Root family, the Cassis family, the Moloffs, the Josephs, or some of their names you might hear around here. And so, on my mother's side, my mom, my great-grandparents came over from Lebanon and settled in Charleston in the early 1900s. And my grandmother, as we call her Siti, was the oldest of 8 siblings, born in Charleston in 1904. And my mother was born in Charleston in 1937. My grandmother married my grandfather who came from Lebanon. My mother married my father who came over from Lebanon. My dad had been all over the place prior to coming to Charleston. And really one of my heroes, and I'll share hopefully about them and the story. But part of my story was always remembering where our family came from, the rich heritage that it has, and the name Shahid or Shahid. A lot of people call it Shahid growing up. Joe helped bring it back to its roots, my cousin Joe here. Shahid, which means he shed his blood. And I'm sure the story is amazing, but it's powerful for us. And in the early 1800s, one of our great-grandfathers, 6 back, was peddling goods in Syria. And Syria, of course, very Muslim at the time, and under a very strict ruler, and our family, of course, Christian. The family name was Jabor at the time. So he's peddling goods in Syria with his 2 brothers, and unfortunately they were wearing their colorful Lebanese clothing, not for any reason other than that's what they were wearing. And it was during, I believe, a Muslim holy period, and they took offense to them wearing what they were wearing, and they imprisoned them, and they basically told them they had to renounce their faith and announce Allah as the one true God, or they were going to be killed. So our grandfather's 2 brothers did so. Our grandfather said he could not do that, and he was put in prison for the night to think about it. They gave him the night to think on that, and he prayed, and he prayed that God would provide for his family. And the next day, they brought him out in the public square, and they asked him again, and he said, I can't do it. And I wouldn't ask this of you. Very nervous and very much pleading with them. I'm a father, or my wife, I wouldn't, respect your faith. And unfortunately, they killed him. They beheaded him. They put a sword in his side. They had him sitting in a chair, if I remember correctly. And as his head came up, they beheaded him. And the story goes that there was, he was saying the Our Father as he was killed, and the blood was coming out in the form of a cross on the road. And but he had prayed before he died that the good Lord would provide for his family back in Lebanon. And as we understand it, his wife's cabinet started overflowing with rice and wheat. And when the brothers returned back to Lebanon to tell what happened, she understood why the cabinets were like that. And this story, we have family in Birmingham, Alabama that are Shaheeds, my mother's first cousins, Joe's dad's first cousins, and they were at a Lebanese convention, I think in California at the time, and they met some Jabors, and they knew the story. So the story was put in the church in Lebanon. Somebody went and took it out, which makes my mother was very upset about this, because it was in the church. But anyway, our family has copies of the story. So the history of that has always been close to my heart, and close to, it's part of our heritage. It's part of where our family came from, and our name came from. So I love sharing that. I was a very, raised in a fairly traditional Catholic home. I was an only child. My parents lost 2 before me. I came along like 10 years later, and my parents were very faithful Catholics, and my mother especially, her faith in so many ways. She always, as I was growing up, she just relentlessly walked that line. Of this is what, not really going to give in to, to you, and I was quite mischievous, and back in those days, Mount Pleasant was a place where you could get a little bit of trouble. I don't think my kids could get the same trouble I got in today that I could get in back then. It was just such a different world, and some of those things were innocent, some of those things were more complicated, but we could have fun, and we probably had too much fun, unfortunately. But you know, you had your roots, and so I drifted some. I went off to Clemson, which was the place I wanted to go to school growing up. I had opportunities to play small school college soccer, but I couldn't play at Clemson, but I wanted to go to Clemson. And I was sort of burned out in soccer. I was kind of ready to have fun, to have my education, play soccer again for enjoyment. And so I went, and I remember, you know, I wasn't practicing when I was at Clemson. I was not going to church, you know, those first few years up there. I would go when I came home to Charleston to visit, and I remember my Aunt Louise, my mom's sister, who was very dear to me, calling me on my birthday to wish me happy birthday, and I was on the couch after a long night the night before, and she said, "Who's the priest out there in Clemson?" And I didn't know, so I hung up with her, and I called my cousin Tony Cassis, who was same year as me, sophomore. I said, "Tony, who's the priest of the church out here in St. Andrews?" He told me. I called my aunt back, and you know, she obviously knew I didn't know. But that was, you know, I had the good fortune of joining a fraternity. When I got there, and this was part of God's path for me, and you know, I'm a recruiter. I own, as Frank said, a company called Fulcrum Staff, and we help companies hire people we recruit. And this recruiting theme sort of is prevalent in different places in my life. But one of them was early on. You know, I was going through Brush to join a fraternity. Really good group of guys. A lot of guys from Charleston that I knew, and I decided the first semester, you know, I'm gonna wait. I'm gonna wait till mid-year, but I plan on going back to that same group. And then in that time, I want to say it was October, maybe November, there was a new fraternity that started up, and myself and some guys on my fraternity hall and my roommate, who didn't join, but we had become friends with some other guys that we already knew, and they were part of this, getting this fraternity started. And so I was intrigued because they were really good guys, and really enjoyed spending time with them. And so I thought I was going to go join that one, but I ended up helping. You know, this fraternity was off the ground. Ended up joining in January, and we pledged. We started a pledge season as they were trying to distinguish between the original guys and the next group. And so we came through, and then, you know, that group got in a little bit of trouble. We shifted. We kind of changed what we were doing a little bit, and sort of refocused and committed to being. We wanted to be the best fraternity on campus. We wanted to be we wanted to treat women the right way. We wanted guys that knew how to communicate. We wanted to be, you know, guys that did philanthropic activities. Just a well-rounded group of guys that were going to work together. And so we actually kicked out a bunch of guys in the fraternity and reduced down to 27, and then just very slowly, you know, built a very special group of men into the fraternity. And you know, fraternities have a stereotype and reputation, but I go, you can't put 70 men in a room, half from South Carolina, half from all over the country, and tell them, you know, you got to solve the problem. You disagree on all kinds of stuff. If you're from South Carolina, you're from New Jersey, you don't usually share the same opinion if you're 18 on certain things. But you know, there was a lot of wonderful lessons that came out of that time, and it was quite rewarding to be part of building that and bringing folks into it. I served as rush chair, so I was in charge of recruiting. And we were very picky, but we had some really special men come join us, and then we grew over time, and eventually we're fortunate to get in the fraternity hall, and I chose to live on that hall because it was a lot of hard work, and that's surprisingly enough where I started going to church on Sundays, because there was a group of men on the hall that were Catholic, and some of the little sisters, and I realized, I didn't know it at first, but they'd been going to Mass and then going to breakfast. So, you know, positive peer pressure. Jamiel's like, why am I not doing that? I should be going with them. So I started going with them to Mass and breakfast, and I started telling myself, all right, even if I'm going to go out and have a good time, I'm going to church. I'm going to go to church every Sunday. So that wasn't going to be my excuse for so. That was the start, right? And so it was just a little bit of a wheel, and the wheel kept getting a little bit bigger and better from me. And I ended up being president of the fraternity my senior year, I guess my second senior year. And by that time, at that time, my last year, we got us into what's called Upper Aquatic Clemson, which was neat. And so anyway, but the story was special to us going through those trials and learning and growing together. But the faith journey really started again there, because I started as when you're president of the fraternity, you have more responsibility on you. So I took that serious. So I was, doing a little less of indulging in things and a little more being ready to discuss things. And Sometimes I had to talk to police officers if they came to the house, whatever it might be, but it all helped because I was doing less of the stuff I should have been doing and more of the stuff I needed to be doing. And I worked at the golf course, and so I was going at 5, 6 o'clock in the morning to the golf course. And then, I was going to mass on Sundays, whether it was in the morning or evenings. And so it really carried over to when I then got my first job. I had done an internship with IBM, Frank touched on it, and that was like doing my junior year in Raleigh. And I thought I was going to go work for IBM. Great group, learned a lot. Came back to Clemson, finished my time at Clemson, last year when you're doing your interviews, I had an offer from PricewaterhouseCoopers, and I really liked IBM, and I really knew IBM, and I could see my path there. And I didn't know people in Charlotte, but I think I got to give this a try. So my uncle Sid was actually kind of instrumental in having me do out a pros and cons list and processing, how to decide where to go. And so I did that, and then I said, hey, I can go back to IBM later if this doesn't work. I got to give this a try. So I went to Charlotte, and carrying over some of those better habits from my days and latter days in Clemson, going to mass, and then I started, it started to hit me a lot. Why do I go to confession? Why do we do that? I didn't like being asked these questions and not really remembering the answers from my, catechesis growing up, right? Like it was there somewhere, but it wasn't something I was at. So the wheels started turning, and fortunately at the church I was going to, the leader of the education ministry there had a wonderful program, and she was doing different subjects all the time, just like that one, about the Eucharist or about confession or about. And I just at the time I really just wanted to be armed with how do I answer a question if somebody asks me, because I should know this stuff, right? I'm Catholic, and so that was, again, the wheel just, for me, like, just getting a little bit bigger and a little bit better. And so, near the end of my time in Charlotte, went through a pretty crazy stretch of life. A couple things were going on there. My Uncle Sid, who was a very big part of my life, got diagnosed with cancer. Y'all forgive me. I'm already a softie, as my wife will say, but I'm also coming from a funeral today with a little 3-year-old child that died, which is one of the reasons I'm dressed up. So a lot of emotions going on today, but anyway, I was going through some other changes in life. In that same sort of window of years, I had gotten married to a woman that it was an unfortunate, bad situation that I got myself into, and thankfully, it was a very short-lived thing. As hard as it was awesome, and I saw God's hand in it, and went through the annulment process that our faith has, and there's nothing easy about the annulment process. I mean, there's nothing easy about it, but it's part of our faith, and it's part of the journey, and I knew I had to go through those steps, and I did, and you really put your hands in the faith of your church and the faith of the people that run your church, because you think you know what the outcome is going to be, you really don't know until it happens. Mark shared his story back in May when June was here. But anyway, went through that process. My Uncle Sid passed, and then I was very fortunate in 2010. Bob Boackle, who a lot of people in this room know, who's been very close to my family since before I was born, had invited me to go to Cursillo. And I didn't want to go to Cursillo. I did not want to go to Cursillo. I knew what Cursillo was about. I had a pretty good idea at least. I was on to a teen. What's that? Okay. I went to a teen retreat that was called Happening. It was an ecumenical Christian thing run by the Episcopalian Church. It was a beautiful, wonderful weekend. I served on the team after that. Whatever. I just, I don't know. I was not going to. And then my Aunt Larice said to me, you've been grouping. I've been going with Bob. Would go to mass on Saturday mornings, and Bob Boackle's men's Cursillo group would go, eat breakfast and group afterwards. I just didn't know what I was doing. I just thought, a group of men I admire from Christ our King and have for many years, and they get together every Saturday and have breakfast, and he's invited me, I'll go, and I'll share in their discussion. You can't be around those guys and not grow, because they're all so spiritual, and Ernie Torres, and it was just an amazing group of men, Dr. John Roberts and so forth. So anyway, so she said, you've already been grouping, and I said, that's what Cursillo is? And she said, yes. So I went, and it came at a good time in my life. It came at a better time in my life than I really understood at the time it came at. But I went to Cursillo, and Cursillo is one of those things that will meet you where you are. You don't, there's an emotional component of Cursillo, but not everybody necessarily needs that, but it's there, and there's different attributes of it, and it's a really beautiful short course on our Catholic faith. It's a full day on the sacraments, and so I really had some perspective coming out of the weekend, and I don't know if I was supposed to see it, but I saw, I don't know if Dr. Deacon Bob did this on purpose or not, but I saw when he filled out the candidate information, for me to be sponsoring me, the sponsorship information, I guess to say, he had a note on there and it said, "We need him for the people he will bring." And I never forgot that, and I realized that he very intentionally recruited me to Cursillo, and I needed to take that serious. So I came out of Cursillo, something I've been meaning to do for a while. I was part of the young adult group in Charlotte. It was a great group of people. We had theology on tap, and you had all these wonderful speakers. And so I came home, and I said, I need to join the young adult group here. I just need to meet some new folks, it was what an amazing, amazing group that was. Ann Hobday was part of that group. Richard White, that many of you know, Richard is now in Texas with his beautiful wife and her family. And just met some amazing people. In fact, the leader of that group when I joined it, ended up moving out of town, and a new group of guys led that. It was Richard White and Jacob Whalen and a couple other people. And so participating in that group was very special. We had weekly study on a weekly Bible study. We did a monthly speaker series on why Catholic, and so many fruits came out of that. It was very faith focused, and the friendships and the bonds that came out of there to me have always been special. Through that group, I also met my wife, and what an amazing blessing she is. So a couple years into being part of that group, we were doing all kinds of stuff. We were taking food to the families at MUSC Children's Hospital. We were doing roughly, I want to say every 4 weeks, we found out that the neighborhood house, there was one guy at the neighborhood house that was every single Saturday going to get leftover produce from the produce market. I thought, wow, we can give that guy a break. Let's go do that. So one Saturday out of the month, we would go, help out, just to give him a break and pick up the leftover produce from the market and take it back to the neighborhood house. And then we got to really learn what the neighborhood house was doing, which was a wonderful thing to learn. And so, we were doing some different things. And then, I said to Richard White, I said, we need a nonprofit. We need a formal nonprofit because we need some kind of a vehicle. We were using the Knights of Columbus to do this and some other group to do that. We just didn't have any way to flow these things, but we had reason to have a nonprofit. And there was an idea of doing a charity event for the Daughters of St. Paul. And of course we were in their building. We were using the back of their building for study, and they had some repairs needed for the building, and so we said, let's do something. I said, let's do a bowling tournament. It's different. And a lot of this group doesn't golf. I mean, I would be happy to golf every day, but I don't think a lot of the people in this group, and we can attract a bigger crowd if we do something different, so let's do a bowling tournament. So I mentioned that in passing to Richard, and then it was. I remember very distinctly. It was January 1st. It was I had everybody over to my house. We were watching football, and everybody left, and Richard kind of hung around. And I said, "What's up, man?" And we need to do that fundraiser now. The daughters need money for this building project. We need to do it now. So I said, okay. So we grabbed the laptop. We did a little budget. We've got like 6 weeks. It's January. At the time, I was doing some seasonal tax work. I need to go back and tell that story in a second. But at the time, I was doing some seasonal tax work while I was, building my staffing business, and it was a lot. It was a lot going on. But we put this thing together in like 6 weeks, and I think we learned a ton from it. I mean, it was a hit. I mean, we only raised $3,000 that first year, but part of that event was to raise community. Right? We were trying to do something fun that we could bring the community together for. And so the next call Richard and I made was to Ann. She was involved in it from the beginning. But we put that event together. We learned some stuff from it. Every year got a little better. The next year was 5,300. The next year was 6,300. The next year when it was 8 or 9, it went to 10, and then it got a little bit better. And so, we got a little better every time. We got a little more. It was the fun bowl. It was fun, and the daughters would come out and bowl, and so it was a nice event. But it was the second year of it, we needed that vehicle. So we went and created Lucis via Charities, which was, we had changed the young adult group name, I think right after that, to Lucis via, and correct me if I'm remembering that wrong, which means light the way, or way of light, depending on how you want to interpret the Latin. But that vehicle was created. We set out to create the nonprofit. We sent off hoping to get approved. In those days, I will say, I don't think it was a given we were going to get a nonprofit that was faith-based approved, because it was not a very friendly environment, to be honest, from the IRS or our president at the time or anything like that. So we got it approved, thank God, and we were an official 501c3. So that was great. So now we could do the Fun None Bowl. We had an official way to distribute, to raise the money, distribute it. People could make tax-deductible donations, and we kept doing the Fun None Bowl. At that time, it was annual, and then we could do our other fundraising things and give to other things that we were trying to support. And so, time, as Frank kind of alluded to, time passed a little bit, and trying to remember the timeline. I want to say it was 2018. We were doing the things we were doing with Lucis via Charity, but Richard and I had talked, and Richard's co-founder of Lucis via Charities. He's not here, but he's a big part of it. But we can do more with this. There's a bigger purpose for this nonprofit being formed, and that was about the time that Frank had the vision for what we ended up naming Carolina Cali Professionals, and a room in the back of the Daughters Bookstore. Sort of the board meetings were started, and the group came together of wonderful group of leadership people, David and so many others, and the name Carolina Cali Professionals came around. So we didn't need to create a whole new nonprofit. We had one, and so it was a perfect affiliation and an opportunity to really kind of more fully utilize that vehicle. So that was pretty special. Backing up just a step, I was an accountant, and accountants aren't supposed to be in sales, and I went into accounting. It was an older cousin of mine, Brian Michelle, who said to me when I was young, "You ought to go into accounting as a profession. Even if you choose not to do it, you'll get a good sense of business." I said, "All right." I remembered that. I went into Clemson. I majored in accounting. I minored in management. But I knew if I didn't like accounting, I had some options, and I knew I'd have a deep sense of business. So that kind of stuck with me. And so I doing accounting for a couple years at PwC. Met some amazing people and worked on some amazing client engagements. But I just wasn't loving what I was doing, and I've always just been better at being a little bit bigger fish in a small pond. But I had this vision of being in sales, and I think I want to be in something sales oriented. And I had a fraternity brother, David Rosenberg. We called him Rosie, and Rosie was an accounting major. He was working in public accounting too. But Rosie always had a bunch of little business things going on the side, and so I was talking to Rosie, and I said, thinking about sales, and he said, I was always running ideas by Rosie, because he pretty much really thought about everything and had, he could tell you, like, well, this is what you're looking at, this is the risk, this is the, But Jamiel, you ought to get into recruiting, you'd be really good at it. And I just kind of blew him off. And a couple of months passed, and Rosie and I were chatting again, and he said, "You ought to get into recruiting. You'd be a lot like Jeff Kemp," which is a recruiter he introduced me to. Probably helped that Jeff was a CPA, and Jeff was a Clemson guy, so I could relate to him a little bit. But I think that Jeff was just very genuine in how he approached things with me. So I saw him as different than the other ones that I knew at that time. And this is long before LinkedIn and social media. We didn't have any of that back in those days. So if somebody called you as a recruiter at a company, you don't have any idea how they got their name. It's very So anyway, wheels were turning a little bit, and then I'm sitting at my desk in the office, and I got a phone call from one of my favorite clients, and they said, "Hey, Jamiel, we want to interview you for our assistant controller role. Jason's going to work at Bank of America." I said, "All right, sounds good." And then about 20 minutes later, I got a phone call from one of my old audit managers at PwC who had left and started an accounting and finance staffing business. And he knew a lot about the industry, had a company that was publicly traded as one of his big clients, and he did all their stuff. And so David called me and offered me, "Hey, we got an analyst job open at Transamerica. Would you like to interview for it?" And I said, "I'm not really interested in that, but are you hiring anybody right now?" Because I had this little seed in my head from my old friend Rosie. And he said, we are looking to hire." And so I started interviewing with David. I started interviewing with my client, and two completely different opportunities, right? And I remember coming home and talking to my parents and my mother, and because I had one that was a complete startup, right? You're 2 years out of college, you've got student loans, you got a truck payment, you got insurance, you got all these things, and I could support myself. I did not need any help from anyone, and nor did I want to be back on my parents' payroll after all their hard work to get me off of it. This is their time; they don't need me back on, So I've got this in my mind. I'm really feeling this recruiting itch, right? It's networking, it's meeting people, it's knowing people. I got accused of walking around Clemson and running into people that you ever run into somebody you don't know on campus? And so I just felt like this was a natural fit. But I'm young, I'm single. If I'm going to give this a go, this was probably the best time to do it. And if I fail, I fail. But I came home and talked to my parents, and I'll never forget my mother. God bless her. She said, Jamiel, here's the two opportunities. I'm telling them about them, and she says, if this is what you want to do, go for it. You're going to be great at it. That's what we're here for. Go. So it was a little nudge I needed, but it was planted with the seed of my friend Rosie, and I'm so blessed. 24 years later, I'm still doing recruiting. I have an amazing, group of clients and candidates, an amazing team. Part of what I believe has always been called to do is to bring faith into our work. We pray every day in my office. We start every morning with the gospel reading and the reflection of Bishop Aaron, or sometimes we pick a different reflection from YouTube. We go around the table, offer our intentions, and so many people that need prayers, and so many causes, and our work, and just offering our work. So that's always been a huge part of. I don't know. We've been doing it so long. I don't know what it'd be like. I just kind of promised myself when I hired my first employee, we were gonna bring prayer into this, part of this, and so that's always been a big part of me. But I was recruiting for PwC. They put me on the recruiting team before I left, and I was recruiting for the fraternity. And I don't know. I think that role has just fit me well, and it's about knowing people and bringing people into what you're doing, and I love that. So I can't help but think about that theme that is kind of what I do every day for a living. And you always say, if you can find what you love to do and make it your job, you're going to be happy going to work every day. You're never going to have the Sunday where you dread getting up for work. You just ruins your Sunday, right? So I've been very blessed because I've been doing this now for 24 years. And it was a grind. I started in Charlotte. I started in 2001, 5 years before 9/11. We were in a bad economy. And I remember telling myself, hey, if I can build a good name in a bad market, I can build a great name in a great market. And so 9/11 hit 5 weeks later. Of course, we had no idea what was going to happen, and it got worse. And I kind of said, all right, if I can build a good name in a bad market, I can build a great name in a great market. And in fact, I actually think, to be honest, building a name in a bad market is a really great thing to do, because you have to kind of outwork everybody. And I tell my kids all the time, there's nothing in life that's going to come easy that isn't going to take a lot of hard work. There's nothing that's going to come easy. Anything that's worthwhile is going to take hard work. So anyway, that was a little bit about how I got to where I was. But Presidio became the big backdrop for me in a lot of ways, because the faith really sort of went in a whole different direction. Frank told me I had 3 hours. So the deepening of faith, the idea of getting together with these men every week for an hour, and learning from each other, and even if you go and have a bad day, a bad week, I don't have anything to share and study, how am I going to add to this group? But it might be the day that somebody brings something up and it's the book you read, and you're going, hey, you need to read this book, or you need to use this, or you're just getting some incredible wisdom from somebody else who's sharing what they did, and the holy moments are special. It's just a wonderful accountability and way to grow. And so that started, Joe and I, started the first one, or ours, I guess, in 2010. It wasn't the first one, but it took a little trial and effort, and we had a few misses getting the date right and the people together and so forth, but it was the two of us. And then it was, the next, guys that would come to the weekend or just come join us, and so that grew. And then not long after that, David C. and Richard Garcia was a big help of that, started Patriarch Men's Ministry, which I think is also so powerful. The idea of us living our faith as men of faith, as men called to just Christ-centered manhood, right? So anyway, those have all been moving moments for me. And then, as I fast forward in life, and I don't know how much time I have, so I'm gonna jump ahead a little bit here. you know, we took a little bit of, my wife Bridget and I took a bit of a leap of faith. At my wife's encouragement, it was not my idea, but my parents were getting older. I was always going over there to help them do stuff, and Bridget said, we need to move into one house. We need to be in one house. And I said, no. I love my mom and dad. I'm not moving in with mom and dad. And the long story short is, of course, the wife usually wins and is right in these things. And we did. We moved in with my parents, but my parents were not excited about this at first either, right? You know, but my wife could see how much I was. My mom had advanced Parkinson's. I was going back and forth over there all the time to help out with stuff. And could be my mother fell, could be the TV broke. I mean, just name it. And so we moved in. We set out for this plan. We kept trying to find a multi-generational house. We weren't. We found this lot. And we kind of kept driving back around to that lot. Lot's still there. So that was the plan. We ended up buying this lot, moving with my parents, renting our house out, changing their house around a little bit. But one of the really neat moments in how God worked, and there's a few stories, and I don't know if I'll get to share all of them, to be honest, but one of them was we were going about, we waited 4 years to build a house, right? And so we bought it in 2016. We had all this work to do on the lot, and things were going on. And so we broke ground. We got the construction loan on March 6th. We broke ground March 13th of 2020. Of course, COVID was just starting right then. And I'm thinking, who waits 4 years to build a house and then they start it in the middle of the pandemic, right? But just ridiculous. But we did it, and we had incredible builders. Sea Island builders were wonderful, and they were on the front end of everything. We were kind of in the early days of it. So I kept praying for a smooth transition. My parents have been in this house for 20-something years. We're building this house that we're moving them into. And my prayer was for my parents more than anything else, that we have a smooth transition into this house. And so we go through the year, and every day was part of our prayer routine. And then in November, and the plan was, I was going to, my parents were on board, even though I know it was like going to be a challenge and a change for them. But the plan was, Dad's kind of gave me the keys. If you fix this house, if you do what you think you need to do to sell it, it was a well-built house back in '85 by Joe's dad. My great aunt and uncle lived in it, and my other great aunt and uncle lived in it, and my parents lived in it. And but it needed a lot of updating, and so the plan was, we're going to update this. We'll get settled in the new house. We'll get it updated. I'll oversee it, and we'll move. Well, we moved into the new house in January, and I remember the first night was really hard on my parents. My dad in particular said, I miss my house. But the second day, we really settled in, and it was like we saw. We were very fortunate. It was a beautiful lot, and kind of, I think it helped. So my prayer was for that transition, but the prayer that God was answering. My wife was pregnant, it just become pregnant with our fourth child, and it was early days of a very bad pregnancy, and we had 3 children before. None of them were necessarily easy pregnancies, but they weren't like this one. And she had what's called hyperemesis, where she was either throwing up or in bed, and so it was tough. I had the kids. I was taking care of my mom and running the company, and my poor wife was feeling terrible because she was feeling terrible and couldn't help, and we were in and out of the hospital. Bridget had it got more complicated. I mean, she got, she had to be hospitalized with a hyperemesis. At one point, I had my dad in the hospital upstairs, my wife in the emergency room, and so all this stuff was going on in the spring of 2021, and then Bridget's hyperemesis got a hair better, thankfully, and she goes for her checkup, 18-week checkup, and I'm at home getting the kids dressed late in the day. Excuse me. And she called and she says, well, I've got some good news. The good news is the baby's doing great. The bad news is I'm a centimeter dilated, and they're sending me to the hospital to get a cerclage put in. I'm like, all right. So she goes to the hospital. I eventually, had some family come over and help, and I went to the hospital. And then the next day we had to go back and they put a cerclage in. Well, a week of that didn't go well. My poor wife really went through it. And they had to redo this whole procedure a week later. So she's going through this, and it really hit me that the transition I was praying for this whole time, God, in November, before we finished and moved in the house in January, we had a group of guys, real estate agent, come to us and say, hey, we got a couple looking to buy a house in Walkendale. And my wife said, talk to my husband, we're going to be selling the house in the spring. And so I met with the real estate agent and said, the house needs a lot of work. And so when she brought the couple over, they looked at the house, and they stood out in the driveway for about 30 minutes. And I'm like, they really like this house, they want it. And so they made an offer. Look, we can't move out until February, so we kind of agreed on terms, and then we moved out in January. They moved in February, or took over in February. But I realized whenever that was, April, May, June, like that whole time period, God's answer to my prayer and that transition was different than the one I was asking for, and it was included. But there's no way we could have done what we needed to do in that house at that time. So it was one of many prayers. I'm going to share one more story, if you don't mind. And my mother passed in 2023, 2 years ago. And when she died, we were in the room. She had Parkinson's and came down with the flu at Christmas. We all had the flu at Christmas. Unfortunately, my mom, she didn't have the lung capacity at that point to overcome it. So we're in the room with her, and my father-in-law had out. You guys ever heard the song "Gabriel's Oboe" from The Mission? The Mission.
Yeah.
It's such a beautiful song, right? And so my father-in-law had said before, like, this is what I think. That song is what I think heaven is like. And and what a beautiful thought. So my mom is breathing her last breaths, and my wife starts playing Gabriel's Oboe in the background and on her phone. And so we're in there praying the rosary. You've got this beautiful music playing. I'm a old school rock and roll. I like my Southeastern rock, Blue Dogs, and it takes me a while to work with the classical music. But this classical music was so beautiful, and I've come to love it. Well, that song was playing when my mother passed, and those few days leading up to it were beautiful. And I won't go into all the details, but I cannot hear that song and not hear my mother. And when she died, a family member gave us these wind chimes, and so it says on them, "In loving memory of Arlene, always in our hearts." And they, there's two really wind chimes go on. Of course, I think of my mom, and I feel like it's like a way of saying hello, or God's way of saying, just saying, mom's up here. But so the first year of her anniversary, she's been past 2 years, and on anniversary date 1, I happened to have to work from home that day. We had somebody come in the house to do some work. I had to be at the house, and I'm like literally in the room above, the open area above where the chimes are, and they just nonstop all day that day. And I couldn't help but it's not usually like that, right? They're going and kids are going. But on the second anniversary, this past January, my wife is playing Christmas music through our Sonos in the kitchen. We're sitting around Saturday morning to have breakfast, and out of nowhere, she's playing Christmas music, and then out of nowhere, Gabriel's Oboe starts playing. Mm-hmm. And we're sitting there in about 20 seconds. Did you play this? And she's like, no, just playing the Christmas music. And those moments where God just very distinctly, to me it was a no doubter. It was a little message from the Lord. So anyway, I jumped ahead. Sorry for the long time, but God's always just done, I think, in my path, created either avenues through other people speaking to me and telling me, like in the example of Rosie or my cousin Ryan Michelle or what have you, or just in those things that I have always grown to, I think, more and more conscious of, those times where he's sending us a little message. And so I didn't get to talk about some of the men in my life, but Joe Shade, as a kid growing up, my dad, my Uncle Sid, Joe, I got compared to Joe a lot growing up, and because he was older than me, and he was, it was a good comparison for me and a good person for me that I could sort of, within a little bit of reach out, think about, okay, and people would get us mixed up sometimes, including his own son. But I was blessed to have those men that were such great examples of faith and family, and anyway, that's part of my story.